Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for being here. We're so happy to have you with us this weekend, and I'm so grateful to be moderating this and introducing my friend Sean and Martha. And I'm just going to introduce myself first. My name is Joseph Mays. I'm an ethnobotanist and anthropologist on Chacruna's Ayahuasca Community Committee, and I've been part of Chacruna's Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative of the Americas. And so I really encourage everyone to check that out at our booth as well as on Chacruna's website. And it's a great resource for connecting directly with Indigenous organizations. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers today. We're going to be hearing from Martha J. Hartney. She's an attorney in Colorado, holding a JD from the University of Denver, Sturm College of Law. Her firm, Hartney Law, is a regional favorite, has received the Best of the West Law Firm Award for 6 years in a row. And she was named a Super Lawyers Rising Star in 2020 and has published and presented on the art and science of death and dying for the last 10 years. Martha is a certified death doula through the Conscious Dying Institute and the first attorney to be admitted to the California Institute of Integral Studies prestigious certificate in psychedelic therapies and research program. Martha is also a trained mediator and has served as a guardian ad litem for the Rocky Mountain Children's Law Clinic. She champions the religious use of plant medicines and advocates for excellent standards of care, best practices, integration work, weaving modern trauma science into the powerful Indigenous practices being stewarded into the Western world. And she lives with her partner and 2 sons who are now grown and in college. She's a member of Chacruna's Council for the Protection of Sacred Plants, along with our second speaker, Sean McAllister, who is one of the nation's leading drug policy reform lawyers. He has pioneered legal and business strategies for entrepreneurs. His work in the psychedelic space has included advising religious organizations on their rights, seeking DEA licensure for a public company manufacturing psilocybin, helping psychedelic-assisted therapists understand the risks of these activities, advising on what is legal in decriminalized cities, and understanding new state regulatory laws like Oregon's Measure 109. His work on drug policy reform goes back 25 years, starting on the Colorado Prison Moratorium campaign in the mid-90s. Sean has served the chair of the board of directors of organization that ran Colorado recreational marijuana legalization campaign, which voters ultimately approved, and has worked on broader drug policy reform issues as a member of the Colorado Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice. Sean is an appointed member of the Denver Psilocybin Mushroom Policy Review Panel, which was the first ballot initiative of its kind in the US, and he's been a legal advisor to other cities and states considering decriminalization, including decriminalized California and decriminalized Seattle. So I want to thank Sean and Martha for being here. And also I want to remind everyone that there will be time for questions at the end. So please remember to post your questions in the Q&A section of the chat and vote on the ones that you want to be answered, because we might not get to all of them. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers. So go ahead and bring them on. Is that ready to go? Let's see. Hi, Sean. Hi, Martha.
Hi, Joseph.
All right, I'll let you all go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to start a little bit. I think we're going to do some sort of tours around religious exemption and religious freedoms, and then we'll do our Q&A. And I'm just going to start with a little bit of background on RFRA and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. I don't want to go through the whole history. There are lots and lots of writings on RFRA. They're all over the internet. And I think our starting point for today, just for the expediency, is to pick it up at in the 2006 case with the UDV and Santo Daime churches, who won for themselves the religious exemption under RFRA. And since that time, no church has received an exemption from the DEA to carry ayahuasca or any other plant medicine under RFRA. Those are the only two churches that currently have that exemption. So I've observed that there are some churches out there who say that they're exempt, and just a word of caution about that, that's actually not entirely true. So that when people buy the $25 ID card as a member of a certain church or one or the other, they may think that that actually protects them from being prosecuted, but it's actually not the case, because RFRA is a very short law. It only does really one thing. It provides for a claim or defense of a religious exercise when the government has burdened it. It doesn't actually say anything about plant medicines or anything about the Controlled Substances Act or any other act that might be implicated by religious exemption or religious exercise. So, when people get those cards and they think that they're protected, that's actually not even true. And the churches aren't really going to help you out if you get arrested. So, word of caution on that. Really ask a lot of questions about when somebody says they're exempt, ask what they actually mean by that. Currently, we are in, of course, the psychedelic revolution, and I have worked primarily in the religion, and I think of the other two areas as decrim and the therapeutic medicinal side, and so I'm really only focused on the religious exemption. And just a note about the religious exemption is when the government substantially burdens the religious exercise, then the burden of proof switches to the government to have to prove that they have a compelling interest in that their burden of the religious exercise is narrowly tailored to achieve that interest. But interestingly enough, there's no mention of the word sincere religious exercise in RFRA or in any other case law, and certainly not in the First Amendment. So the word sincere came in through a lot of case law that recognized that when you give people an exemption from otherwise important rules for everybody, that there's going to be some motivation to lie or to commit fraud or deceit against the government. So the government is actually looking for the sincere exercise of religion. And I think that's what's really in play today. That's what we're going to be looking at more. So I'm going to turn it over to Sean, so he can decrim, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, great. Good evening, everyone. I guess all across the U.S. and across the world. With us, maybe you're watching this as a recording, but maybe you're up at 8:45 on the East Coast right now. And so thanks for sticking with us after a long and amazing day. And it's a thrill to be here with Martha Hartney, my friend and co-counsel in a case we'll be talking about later with the Church of the Eagle and Condor. But yeah, as the long introduction that Joe gave mentioned, to shorten that bio, I certainly have done a bit of work on this decriminalization issue. And, since we're talking about the legality of ayahuasca, I figured it was useful to go over this very quickly, because I think there's some maybe accurate and some inaccurate perceptions of what decriminalization means, and certainly as it relates to ayahuasca. So Martha talked about the religious exemptions, and we're going to probably talk a lot more about that today or tonight. But in terms of non-religious, I think everybody knows Denver was the first city in the U.S. to decriminalize psilocybin in May of 2019, just about 2 years ago now. And obviously Denver's decriminalization doesn't have anything to do with ayahuasca. So don't come to Denver thinking that ayahuasca is decriminalized and you can possess it, because it's not covered by the law. So we'll just unfortunately take my hometown off the table here. I might talk a little bit about state law protections at the end of this, but in terms of religious protections. But in terms of decriminalization, Denver doesn't apply to ayahuasca. So then what happened? Then a month later, Oakland passed a broad entheogenic decriminalization measure that does include ayahuasca. It includes all naturally occurring psychoactive substances. So that would include ayahuasca. Oakland's initiative obviously decriminalized personal possession. It included, transporting entheogens or psychedelics, including cultivating them. It talks about non-commercial distribution, and I'm going to talk a little more about this, but a lot of people say, oh, great, I can go to Oakland and hold a healing ceremony in Oakland because it's decriminalized there. It's not really clear. As we know, as a movement, we're not quite certain on what economic system or access system should look like with entheogens or ayahuasca in particular. And so a lot of these decriminalization measures have talked in terms of non-commercial distribution. And I think what's intended there is the idea of sharing. And so clearly, if you share ayahuasca with somebody in Oakland, you might not be subject to prosecution. But any kind of sale of ayahuasca in Oakland or some of the other decriminalized cities I will talk about, this raises a question. It's a gray area. I also think it's important to note that none of these initiatives change state or federal law. And so in terms of distribution, there was a case in Denver. Now, this was around psilocybin, but this is a good example. Denver decriminalized psilocybin. Some guy comes out in the media and says, great, now it's decriminalized. I can sell it. And if police walk in, I'm possessing psilocybin and he's possessing psilocybin. So what's the problem? Well, actually, the federal government tracked this guy down and said, wait a minute, you're selling psilocybin? That's not what the decriminalization initiative did. And of course, the federal government isn't bound by that decriminalization initiative because that's a local law. So there was a prosecution in Denver for distribution of psilocybin in spite of the decriminalization effort. There's been a prosecution in Oakland of the Zydor Church of God, which was purporting to be a psilocybin church. And I think the case is still under investigation. Maybe it's just been a raid, not a full prosecution. But the point here is that, areas around distribution or having group ceremonies and giving out ayahuasca for money, this is clearly a gray area, even in decriminalized cities. This applies to Santa Cruz, which followed Oakland with a broad entheogenic decriminalization. Although it only decriminalized possession, cultivation, storage of all entheogens in Santa Cruz. It didn't have that distribution language like Oakland did. So again, there's some gray area around distribution in Santa Cruz. The most recent victory was in Washington, D.C., Initiative 81. We heard from Melissa Lavansana earlier today, who ran that campaign, and Lavansani, sorry. Anyways, she was very critical in that initiative, and the DC initiative is equally as broad as Oakland. It has that broad possession, cultivation, distribution for non-commercial purposes. Although some people have taken that and started some, kind of wink, wink, nod, nod systems of, oh, if you buy a t-shirt, you get free psilocybin. This is another gray area that I think anything that has anything to do with distribution, selling ayahuasca, giving it to a large number of people is a gray area in these decriminalized places. And I would just note in Colorado that it's still a felony in Colorado to give a controlled substance to another person, even without money being exchanged. It's obviously a lower level felony, but it is still a felony. So this is why, you have to be very careful, and religious defenses might be a good thing to consider. And I think we're going to talk a little more about that, and Martha's going to pick it up from here. But So yeah, that's the decriminalization situation around the country. Oh, there's one more state. I'm sorry, Oregon. So a lot of people say, oh, Measure 110 in Oregon decriminalized all possession of all drugs, right? The Oregon both legalized therapeutic psilocybin in Measure 109, and then in Measure 110 decriminalized possessions of most controlled substances. It's a bit of a complicated law. We had one of the proponents on earlier today, and I think it's fair to say that small amounts of personal possession of ayahuasca could be decriminalized in Oregon. And actually, the Oregon decriminalization says it's still a crime, but the maximum penalty is a $100 fine, or you have to go see a therapist and get some assessment. You don't necessarily have to follow through with therapy, but the options are $100 fine or get an assessment. And so that would only apply to small amounts of possession. So again, unless you're covered by a religious exemption at the federal level and or state level, which again, Martha's going to pick up on, even in Oregon, holding an ayahuasca ceremony where you give out ayahuasca to multiple people for money, I think is a gray area, risky proposition, unless you have a strong religious defense. So, all right, that's what I got on decrim.
Okay, hey Sean, your video's off? Did you want that?
I see my video. Does anybody else see a video?
Well, maybe I'm not saying it.
Maybe your video.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Okay, so picking it up there, so you were talking about ayahuasca and even having small amounts is still a criminal offense, and it really is. And it's such a sad state of affairs because it's such a profound and beautiful medicine. And so many people have been helped by it. Currently, there's current state of some case law. Just so you know what's going on in the world of ayahuasca law, there's 2 cases currently open. One in Florida and one in Arizona with the NAAVC, the North American Association of Visionary Churches, brought a suit in federal court in Arizona. And then, of course, the Soul Quest case, Chris Young out of Florida. Now, we just got word last week that the DEA denied the Soul Quest petition, which for those of us who are lawyers in this world, this is really big news. And it's not necessarily good news, but it definitely gives us more information about what we're working with. And so you probably already know, if you follow this work, that Soul Quest petitioned at the invitation of the DEA back in 2017. And the DEA promptly sat on it and did nothing with it for 3 whole years until their attorney finally filed suit last August. And shortly thereafter, the parties agreed to go into settlement negotiations, which means everything that goes on in there is private. We don't know what's happening. But we did find out that yesterday the DEA said after their findings, which is kind of like a proctology exam, that they denied Soul Quest. So we're waiting to find out more about the whys. That will give us a lot more information about what our next steps are and what guidance to give people who are really looking to protect their religious use of ayahuasca. We do know that the DEA is intending to engage in rulemaking. They announced that in the NAVC case pleadings. They said to the judge, Judge, you don't need to worry about this case because we're going to go into rulemaking, so we're going to moot it out. So the case was actually still refiled in Arizona once it was tossed out of California. And we are anticipating some period of notice and comment on the DEA's rulemaking, which has been long delayed. They have done nothing since 2006 in the way of formal rulemaking. So we're hoping that there's a lot of good public comment and that they can make some really strong but positive and open-armed rules for the religious use of ayahuasca. But something I think that we need to be very cautious about is the government's going to be looking for all of the indicia of deceit. Anything that looks like people are making it up on the fly, or it's not really religious, it's more spiritual. They are splitting that hair. So you'll need to understand what actually constitutes a religion and what's the difference between religion and spirituality. Because I think those of us who actually drank ayahuasca, we all can agree that it's one of the most profoundly spiritual experiences of our entire lives. even if it's deeply therapeutic and deeply healing, it's still like a profound connection to the majesty of the whole mystery. So the DEA still, the First Amendment and RFRA protect religious exercise, not spiritual exercise, and they do split that difference. So Sean, you want to just chime in on that?
Yeah, I thought maybe we should back up for just a second and remind everybody, in 2006, UDV case, Ocentro got decided, saying that they didn't even question UDV's religious sincerity. They said, obviously, it's a real religion. It's got a lineage in Brazil. And then DEA responded in 2009 with this informal guidance that says, okay, if you want an exemption from the Controlled Substances Act, stop your ayahuasca use, make a petition to DEA, tell us everything about your ayahuasca use, and we'll judge your religious sincerity. Now, the lawyers, Martha and I and others involved in Chacruna, have looked at that, and it's not a binding rule. They did it without any public notice or comment, so it's not an enforceable guidance that they submitted. And but that is the one we've lived with for 11 years with no change and no granting of any petitions other than UDV and Santo Daime. And so I think a lot of people look at that, and now we're going to be able to look at the SoulQuest case, and they look at it and say, well, if you petition DEA, they're just going to find a reason to deny you. And so, as Martha said, a lot of people look at that complexity and say, why would we go through that process? And obviously, Martha and I are not giving you legal advice. You need to consult with a lawyer. We're not your lawyers. But it does look like it's a very challenging process to go to DEA. And as Martha says, you can assert your protections under RFRA in a judicial proceeding. And so this is the way Santo Daime got recognition. They didn't go through the petitioning process. They just went right to court and said, recognize us, and they got recognized. And that's why SoulQuest and the NAAVC case are seeking that same route, although NAAVC did not do the petition process. So anyway, I just wanted to comment on that and say that most people look at that and say it's not worth the brain damage. Let's just either operate without recognition or seek judicial recognition, because DEA is obviously hostile to this issue.
That's right. They, the DEA for sure, you know, they can see this, the crack in the door, and their job is to keep that opening in the door tight and closed as much as they can. So they're not going to just let people flying through the religious exemption door. Yeah. So Sean, you want to talk about the Santo Daime and the UDV cases?
Yeah, I talked a little bit about those, but I guess I just wanted to mention a couple other things. You know, I guess, as I said, those are established, what's called syncretic Christian churches, and the government never challenged the sincerity of those religious practices. In the Ocentro case says it's undisputed that the use of ayahuasca is done for religious purposes. The government at the time said, well, we have two compelling reasons why we can interfere with the use of ayahuasca. One, we want to protect public health and safety because this is a dangerous controlled substance. And two, we want to prevent the diversion of a controlled substance for non-religious purposes. And the court in those cases said that, first of all, there's no evidence that ayahuasca is a dangerous substance. There's actually kind of evidence, the court said, on both sides, but there's not a preponderance of the evidence one way or the other. Many of us would argue, done responsibly with proper screening, that it's not a dangerous substance at all. It's only dangerous if people are using it who haven't been properly screened and have some, significant psychiatric or health issues. But the government in that case wasn't able to show that ayahuasca was dangerous, and they also couldn't show that there was a significant risk of diversion for non-religious purposes. And I think what new churches are going to have to grapple with is, as we've seen this expansion of ayahuasca in the last 10 years in the US, I think it's fair to say there's ceremonies every weekend in every major city, probably in America. I mean, this has become a growing phenomenon in the U.S. that may change the calculus and make it difficult. The government may start saying, hey, this has become a widespread thing. We need to really control this. And that's a scary prospect there. And that's why Martha mentioned rulemaking. It will be very important for us to participate in any rulemaking that eventually happens. With DEA, there's a new administrator being appointed by the Biden administration. This is obviously a very esoteric issue, and we're not sure how much involvement she'll really have on it. But, if DEA gets flooded with a bunch of irresponsible comments about, everybody should be able to use ayahuasca and it doesn't matter if there's a religious connection or not, we just have to be careful with that. Because that could build a record that is used against us. So that's something that comes out of the Santo Daime and UDV churches. One other quick point is that, I advise churches, Martha does as well, about what are best practices if you want to protect yourself from criminal prosecution. And I think there was some sense with UDV and Santo Daime that those churches give some screening to people up front. They explain what the church is about. They, there's not like a test. You don't have to certify that you understand all the liturgy or philosophy of these churches. But I think it is important for people to do more than just sell a ticket to a weekend event for ayahuasca. That UDV and Santo Daime show that there is some education of the participant. There's some understanding of the participant of the doctrine of the churches. And I think it is important the more your project looks and is an actual religious practice, that people understand what they're doing and they're not just there for a bucket list experience. I think you'll have a better case, because all of the hybridized neo-shamanic practices in the U.S., if they don't adopt the Santo Daime or UDV tradition, they're going to face this DEA that's going to want to see sincerity. And I think we can take lessons from those two cases and how the UDV and Santo Daime practice to make our cases better.
Yeah. Can I chime in on that?
Sure.
So this is actually touching in on the difference between religion and spirituality, and there's a notion of religion as being more communal, more of a group doing things, and also providing structure. So more like the exoteric, dogmatic. This is how we live. This is how we do life. This is how we treat each other. This is how we treat our world. That's kind of more of what a religion would entail, versus my connection to divine alone is the expression of my religion. They're actually looking for like structure and connection and like repetitive patterns of behavior. So there's also an idea that the closer a group is to a lineage that already exists, whether it's there's an article recently on Rolling Stone that talked about some of the major religions now creating sub-denominations of medicine churches in like Judaism or Islam or Buddhism and all these other like churches, because they're experiencing their own form of psychedelic renaissance inside those churches. So like there's a clearer line to a lineage there. Similarly, like the UDV and Daime, they have these connections to a longer, slightly older lineage. It was like 40 years old. It wasn't that old. But I think, just things that are just popping out of nowhere and looking like it's being made up on the fly, it's going to be a harder sell. So, it's really a good idea to just to maintain the connection with the origination point of that medicine, specifically ayahuasca that I'm talking about. Yeah, it's not a good idea to make things up on the fly or make up dogma. You actually like really get into the sincerity of what do you really believe? What's sincere for you? How do you live? What governs you? What principles can you extract about your medicine work that governs your behavior and the way you do life now. And I think that's a better start than just trying to make things up.
Yeah, we probably only have a few minutes left. Maybe we should talk about the work we're doing with CEC and then maybe open up to questions. Do you want to start, Martha, or I can start? Either one.
Yeah, sure. I'll start. So I've been working with the Church of the Eagle and the Condor for the last 3 years. Their three-member board have created a really lovely community in Arizona. And we have been preparing to petition the DEA for religious exemption of the use of ayahuasca for this church. And once we started to actually get ready to send it in, we realized like this isn't actually going to work. We saw what was happening with SoulQuest, we saw what was happening with the NAAVC case, and then we pulled back and we regrouped. And we realized after the beginning of the pandemic that there was a more important place to begin, and that is where the Customs and Border Protection began seizing a number of shipments of ayahuasca across the border. So they had a lot fewer people coming across the border, a lot more packages, and a lot more inspections were happening. And so they found approximately 80 to 100 of these packages. And it seems important that this sacrament, which is a great spirit, a blessed spirit, that we take better care of it and not let it end up in the hands of a government. So the CEC and Sean and I have been representing their interests with the Customs and Border Protection, and we recently sent in a FOIA request to find out more about these seizures, about what they've done with them, what they are planning to do with all of the names of the recipients who did not receive their ayahuasca, but just a little slip notice that they had their ayahuasca seized. So you want to take it from there?
Yeah, sure. And we're obviously very early in the process. I think we just submitted FOIA requests last month, both to Customs Border Protection, and we also submitted one to DEA. And we asked for a broad variety of things, all the seizures of ayahuasca in 2020, any internal policies around the seizure, the origin of those packages. The basic word on the street is that everything from Pucallpa is being seized, everything from Peru, really. And this has really been challenging for the medicine community, having to source medicine elsewhere or do extravagant things. And so we have this broad request out, and we've gotten some early information that we could share just a tiny bit now. We still haven't gotten any formal response, but it looks like there was at least 90 DMT seizures at the border last year, and they're trying to break that down for us and determine how many of those were ayahuasca. And so we certainly hope to know, which ones were ayahuasca, how many out of the 950. I'm guessing it's a significant number. We've heard of at least 120 Aya seizures last year. I wouldn't be surprised if half or more of the seizures are ayahuasca. For the most part, we haven't heard of a lot of prosecutions around the seizures. There have been a couple examples. A person in Washington State was raided and attempted to claim, or the package was seized, and then they were subsequently prosecuted. There was a case in New York, a case in, I think, Wisconsin or Illinois. And all those, it looks like the federal government just deferred to state prosecutors and didn't take the cases themselves. But examples out there of that. And then one other thing we're learning from the initial work is that it looks like the government is basically just destroying the ayahuasca as soon as they seize it. They're not giving anyone any due process to petition to have it returned. It looks like there's a blanket policy to destroy all Schedule I controlled substances. And this is obviously very concerning for the plant medicine community when you have a law that says that your religious practice can't be burdened in this way. I mean, obviously destroying the product is burdening your practice. And so we are very hopeful that this work can help the whole community understand what's going on. I did drop, and Bia dropped the link to our GoFundMe for this initiative in the chat, and definitely appreciate all the amazing support we've gotten so far. But yes, we're early in the process. We're learning some amazing things, and I think it's going to benefit the community as we go.
Absolutely. Do we want to, is there anything else you wanted to add, Sean, before we go to Q&A?
I think, yeah, we should go to Q&A.
Okay.
Great, thank you so much, Sean and Martha. I think we've got a precious 15 minutes for questions, but I think you all said a lot, so forgive me if you've already gotten to some of these, but the top question at the moment from Anonymous is, what is the legality of seeds for plants that produce DMT and MAOIs in terms of legal penalty, personal cultivation, yeah, and peer-to-peer exchange?
Martha, you want to do it?
Well, yeah, but since I'm not a criminal lawyer, I'll yield to you in some ways. We do know that, right? Okay, yeah. So we do know that actually, if a plant material like Banisteriopsis does not contain DMT, that's supposed to be legal and importable. There shouldn't be any problem with that. Although we do know that some of the ports of entry are seizing that material. In terms of seeds, I'm not entirely sure, but of seeds, I think as a plant material, it's probably fine. I think if you have the intent to manufacture ayahuasca, then you probably, I think they assume, the government does assume that if you have both of the materials that you're intending to make it. So it's kind of a gray area. I would be cautious, Sean.
Yeah, exactly. Technically, many of these plants are not illegal. They just outlawed DMT itself in the Controlled Substances Act. So there's many DMT producing plants. If you possess them with no intent to extract DMT from them, the plant by itself is not illegal. But if there's any indication you're possessing with intent to extract it, you're trying to extract it, that is illegal. And so, as Martha said, I mean, there's people that have imported a lot of this stuff. But as soon as you try to extract, that's a potential criminal case, unless you have a religious exemption or argument.
Well, this is a perfect segue to this question from Mercedes about what is the language being used to differentiate between a religious versus spiritual with respect to ayahuasca. I know you said a little bit about that, but okay.
Well, I think we're going to find out more about that in the rulemaking process with the DEA. So first, let me say that I don't believe that the DEA should be the organization making that decision, because it's kind of like the fox guarding the hen house, which I wrote about on Chacruna, because I don't think the DEA is rightly tooled to make a decision between what is religion, what is not, and what is sincere and what is not, nor is there any statutory and authority given to the DEA to make those decisions. It's not in the Controlled Substances Act. There's no authority for them to regulate for religious purposes in the Controlled Substances Act, nor is it in RFRA. So, try as we might, we can't find any actual real legal authority for them to make a decision like that. That said, there are some cases that any deciding body, like it would probably be a court, would lean into to figure out what's the difference between a religion and not a religion. And the current watershed case out there is called the Myers case. It's very well known. The Myers factors, sort of like a survey of all these different factors of what looks like a religion, and it includes things like metaphysical beliefs, moral guidelines, how we live our lives, an ultimate picture of the purpose of being alive. What does it mean to be a human on this earth? So, if you want to see that case, you can look it up. Just look up the Myers Religious Factors case. It's a fascinating read. And that case was a district court case. It's actually been cited even by the Supreme Court. So that is our current understanding of what religion is. And then spirituality that's not a thing in the law, although it should be. And maybe there is some growth that can be had through case law in the future, where we can make a case that spirituality is warrants as much protection as the religious exercise.
Yeah, I know we probably don't have time for both of us to comment on every question, but I would just chance to say everything that is religious is also spiritual, but everything that's spiritual is not also religious. And what I really respect about the Church of the Eagle and the Condor is that they really emphasize the indigenous worldview, the indigenous container, the wisdom of the North and South American indigenous people. And this shows that there's some broader vision than just it being solely about the use of ayahuasca, that you have to have some kind of lineage, some kind of belief that is bigger than just the use of the substance itself. There's a case that says if you believe the use of marijuana is religious, that's fine, but that's not really a religion in itself. As Martha said, you have to have a broader set of ethics and some view on the meaning of life, what our relationship to God is. And so, yeah, I just wanted to praise CEC and their work. I think they're uniquely situated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm very hopeful about that. So here's a question that's a little bit unique, not totally relegated to the legal sphere. So this is from Lisa, and she's asking if we intend to respect religious traditions and the sanctity of them in the psychedelic movement. Doesn't someone claiming a religious belief for the sake of taking ayahuasca do the opposite? In your opinions?
I would jump in and say there are definitely people that are going to potentially make bad law by not having thought out their practices. And Martha can maybe say more about that. But yes, we need the best of our community to step forward and get recognized. DEA is I respect deeply SoulQuest, but if you look at their history, they've kind of changed their story over the years. First, they were a Native American church, an ONAC, which is not actually the Native American church. Then they dropped association with ONAC. I wouldn't criticize them. I would just say that their history has provided some avenue for DEA to find reasons to say no. And you can't give this government that doesn't want to expand this exemption reasons to say no. You have to be very careful about how you operate.
Yeah, is there some fear that like doing it the wrong way might be counterproductive, almost might result in kind of holding the good ones back in a way?
Absolutely. If we end up with a few bad cases, it could be bad for everybody. So it would be wise for everyone to really dig into how do we make our actions and our beliefs match with our practices. So the more integrous we can be, the more aligned from our mind, our body, and our spirit, and everything we do, say, and how we work, the better it's going to be for everybody.
Agreed. Okay, so we've got probably time for a few more. Here's a question from Charles about which specific legal codes would need to change in order to recognize personal spirituality in the same context as religion.
Well, personally, I think that at some point we're going to need some congressional action on this question. We're going to need Congress to speak up about how we should regard the spiritual religious use, or even decrim use of plant medicines. So I don't know that it's something that would have to change. It might actually just be new legislation. So I hold in my heart the idea of maybe a new law for plant medicines. That's a federal law.
I think there definitely needs to be changes. I've been reading about Mesoamerican worldview, philosophy, Aztec theology or ontology, the way that Native indigenous people have looked at the world. And the big difference is, Christianity and major religions look for answers to questions about life. What is the meaning of life? What is God's purpose? Indigenous worldview and philosophy tends to look at what is the way of living, not an answer so much, but a process and a way. And that's not what the law is designed to acknowledge. It is designed to acknowledge religions that give us answers. So I think we need a broadening of the concept of religion to include indigenous concepts that many of us deeply identify with. And I think it is preposterous, as somebody said in the chat, why do we have to feign religion? That many of us are engaged in spiritual practices that transcend the limited concept of religion. And we are trying to fit a bit of a round peg into a square hole here. So I think we need some broadening of the concept to essentially protect cognitive liberty, to protect the right to pursue answers in a revelatory practice, that perhaps ayahuasca doesn't set out truth in advance, but rather reveals it in the process. And I think it is protected like that now. I just, I think for other psychedelics in particular, it would be helpful to have that broadening. But ayahuasca has the strongest protections right now in the US of any entheogen. So this is ground zero for this work.
Right. So I think this would be a good question to sort of end on and get both of your thoughts about. And that is from Shane, who's asking, what steps can we take to support the legalization of ayahuasca? And I'll expand that to other entheogens as well.
Sean, I'll let you take that first while I'm thinking about it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I definitely think support Chacruna, support the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative that they launched this week, support the GoFundMe with the Church of the Eagle and the Condor, work on local initiatives. I did want to mention again, there are state law protections and 30 states have adopted an equivalent of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. But a few states still haven't, and several states, about 6, I think, have bad law on religious freedom. So I can give people more information on that. You definitely should start at the local level, think about state level changes, but eventually, as we've been saying, we need some changes at the federal level.
Okay, and I would suggest at a personal level, like locating your community and for your personal practice, doing so in a way that actually looks more like a way of life than going to a ceremony every so often. Like actually like live the way you've become to believe. It would be wonderful to have more financial support for the Church of the Eagle and the Condor as we take on this very big bite. We will be the third player in the legal field other than SoulQuest and the NAAVC church group. So we would love to have some financial support to help us get started. We have 2 lawyers now. We would like to bring on 2 more lawyers to figure out what our next steps is and what our best next move is. So if you can support that, that would be awesome. And Chacruna, of course, is really leading the way in this. And I'm so appreciative to Bia and her whole team for putting together all of this beautiful work and helping us all get going in one direction.
Yes, we're so grateful for Chacruna. And just real quick, what's the best way for people to stay in touch with you both and your work and stay up to date on this struggle? Websites or?
Yeah, putting my website in the chat. Reach out to me. Happy to do calls for a few minutes for free for anybody. And yeah, reach out. There's lots of things out there. The Sacred Plant Alliance through Chacruna. There's other alliances forming every day. So we do need to come together and be thoughtful about how we proceed.
I put my email in the chat. I'm actually an estate planner by trade. So I do this. This is my side gig. So if somebody wants to talk to me, I'm happy to spend some time with people too. Just know I'm currently super focused on the Church of the Eagle and the Condor. So I'll do consultations and help people, figure out some things, and then we'll go from there.
Great. Well, thank you both for your time. And I know this is such a complex and delicate issue, so I appreciate you both helping us all navigate it. And thank you for all the work you're doing. and I think we're going to have to close, unfortunately. I know we could keep going, but
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Many blessings.
yes.
Thank you, Joseph.
Take care.
Bye, Sean. Bye, everybody.
Martha.